Back in 1946, a couple had their first daughter, Joanna, and 5 years later, little Jacqueline joined the family. The two sisters were as close as could be, inseparable, really. Joanna practically took on the role of a second mother, always there to lend her sister a hand. They loved to play with their mother's hair and were known for being a pair of wild, restless kids. When Jacqueline turned 3, she had a pretty bad fall into an empty barrel, leaving her with a visible scar on her forehead. Joanna, too, had her own unique mark, a small birthmark on her belly. The older one, Joanna, used to say the strangest thing. She'd never grow up to be a woman. People thought it was just a kid talking nonsense. Yet, oddly enough, those words would later prove to be almost hauntingly accurate. Then, one day in May 1957, the sisters were heading to church along with one of Joanna's classmates. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. A terrible accident happened. They were struck by a car. The driver was a distraught woman, apparently intent on taking her own life. She had swallowed what she thought was a lethal amount of several different drugs. Feeling faint, she lost control of the vehicle and veered straight onto the sidewalk where the children were walking. The impact was immediate and devastating. The kids never stood a chance, trapped between the car and a wall behind them. But the driver survived. John and Florence were completely shattered by grief. Florence threw herself into any chore she could find, trying to keep her mind off their daughters, hoping to dull the pain. But John, unable to escape his sorrow, found himself thinking of nothing else but the girls. On the night they died, he had a vision of Joanna and Jacqueline already in heaven. Then, a week after the tragedy, he thought he saw their spirits lingering in one of the upstairs rooms. After that, he barely left that space. God must be punishing me for asking for proof of reincarnation, he mused. Even so, he couldn't shake the belief that he would get the evidence he was looking for. Not long after, Florence found out she was pregnant again. John was certain it was a sign. Higher powers had heard his prayers. He even went so far as to predict they'd have twins, reasoning that 2 souls would need 2 bodies. Florence just waved him off. The doctor hadn't mentioned twins, and there was no history of them in either family. Back then, ultrasound scans weren't commonly used. But it turned out John was right. Come the fall of 1958, Florence gave birth to twin girls, Jillian and Jennifer. Remarkably, Jennifer had a birthmark on her forehead, exactly where Jacqueline's scar had been, and Jillian had one on her stomach, just like Joanna. When the twins were around 3, John and Florence decided to show them the toys that had once belonged to their deceased sisters, which had been tucked away in the attic. They were floored when little Jillian pointed to one of the dolls and said it had belonged to someone named Joanna. Jennifer did the same, saying that another doll was Jacqueline's. Then, to their parents' astonishment, the twins claimed that Santa Claus had brought them the toys, as if they remembered the gifts that were actually given to the late girls for Christmas. Most kids would squabble over toys, not wanting to share, but not these two. It was almost as if they already knew exactly which toy belonged to whom. Florence also noticed something unsettling. She would sometimes catch her daughters whispering about details of a car accident. One day, she heard Jillian touch Jennifer's head and murmur something strange. "Blood is flowing from your eyes. That's where the car hit you." Stunned, she shared this eerie conversation with her husband. John then revealed that when he had gone to identify the bodies, Jacqueline did, in fact, have a bandage over her eyes. On another occasion, Jillian pointed at Jennifer's birthmark and said, "That's the scar she got when she fell into the barrel." To John, it was like a sign. Confirmation that the spirit of Joanna was living on in Jillian, and Jacqueline's soul was now a part of Jennifer. Florence, though still skeptical, couldn't deny the bizarre connections that kept surfacing. Of course, this wasn't the only thing that led John to believe in the reincarnation of their lost daughters. Before the accident, Florence used to help him with milk deliveries and wore a special work coat. After the tragedy, she left that job behind and never looked back. Then one day, while John was repainting the fence, he grabbed his wife's old coat to wear. Out of nowhere, Jennifer ran up to him and asked, "Why are you wearing Mommy's coat?" She later mentioned it to Jillian, who simply shrugged and asked, "Why would that coat belong to Mom?" This left John deep in thought. He recalled that Joanna, being the older sister, had already started school and had never seen her mother in that coat since it was only worn during work hours. So how did Jennifer know it belonged to Florence? When he asked her, she innocently replied, "Dad. She used to wear it when she delivered milk." Shortly after the twins were born, the family moved out of Hexham to a bigger town. About 3 years later, they decided to visit their old hometown. Even though the girls had never been there before, they seemed to know the place quite well. They confidently asked to go to the park and ride on their favorite swings, even though they had never laid eyes on them until that day. As they grew, it became clear that the twins' personalities matched those of their late sisters. Jillian always looked out for Jennifer, giving her the best of everything she had, just as Joanna had done. The twins also shared a love for playing with their mother's hair and were full of restless energy. Jillian, just like Joanna, was more outgoing than her twin and seemed curious about things far beyond her age. She appeared more mature than Jennifer. But if you kept in mind the memories of Joanna and Jacqueline and entertained the idea of reincarnation, it all started to make a strange kind of sense. If soul migration is real, then it makes sense why the twins were so terrified of cars. Their fear would sometimes spiral into full-blown hysteria. Mr. Pollock later shared with reporters that there was one incident where he was walking with the girls down a dark alley, and a car suddenly honked behind them. They started crying so hard that they nearly passed out. They were paralyzed with fear, unable to move. It reminded him of that dreadful day when Joanna and Jacqueline were trapped with nowhere to go because a fence was blocking their escape. The similarities between the twins and their late sisters showed up in the smallest details. Jillian had the same slim build as Joanna, while Jennifer was stockier, just like Jacqueline. Even their way of walking seemed to mimic that of their older sisters. Back when the accident happened, Jacqueline had only recently learned how to write. She would hold a pencil in her little fist, clenching it like a child who's still learning how to use their hands. Jennifer did the exact same thing until she turned 10 and, oddly enough, even as a teenager, she sometimes reverted to that grip. As the twins grew older, around 5 or so, the signs of the past slowly faded away. They became more like ordinary kids, and the strange behaviors or comments stopped. Jillian and Jennifer no longer spoke of their deceased sisters. When they turned 13, Mr. Pollock decided it was time to share with them the idea of reincarnation. He explained that they were actually the reborn souls of Joanna and Jacqueline. Naturally, the girls didn't believe a word of it. Then, at the age of 20, Jillian had a vivid vision of a house, the one the Pollocks had lived in until Joanna was 4. She described every little detail of the mansion, and when reporters went there, they were stunned by how accurate her recollection was. Jillian and Jennifer eventually grew up to be regular women, leading ordinary lives. They got married, had children of their own, and continued on with life. Sadly, not much more is known about what happened to them after that.